No matter how unique your life is, we live vicariously through our friends and enemies, always taking in stories from outside and applying them to our own. Although information has increased today, it still does not take away the fact that this has been the case forever. The information that is brought to us by people, elites, or the rest of society still affects us in every single way. Now, this is why it is a question between many historians and many people who debate these type of topics anyway, whether or not elective systems are better than hereditary systems. Now, of course, hereditary systems have existed for an extremely long time, but this is something that is not being explored for various reasons. One of them, of course, is to try and give the impression that elections are something new, fresh, and they're a mock up from the old systems that are related to the olden day people who did not know what they were doing. This is a sort of trap. The only true thing that is new about the elective systems that exist today, and I'm refusing to call them democracies for now because I think that makes it seem like we're talking about something that is very specific, but in real life, we're talking about elective systems. The only thing that's novel about them is that most people step down after 4 years. This new version of elective systems makes sure that the people who want to get elected do at least some of the things that they promised to do before they got elected. Now, the difference between the old time elections and the new time elections is that most of them were very representative, meaning that the old versions were taking people who were in elite positions in local terms, and they would pass on messages from people who they represent. Today, and in other situations in the olden day, individuals got to vote specifically for themselves in what some people would call a direct election or a direct democracy. For the ancients and even people today, people actually don't realize that rulership or the governance of countries is less about the social situation or even individual things that are happening within the country and more a question of good and evil. For some, more literal than others. For example, if you take kings who represented God on earth, pharaohs who also represented gods on earth, the Sumerian kings as well, or even the Berber, which is not the Berber of North Africa, but instead the title of the king of the Jollof Kingdom, an elective system. Well, why would I say that it's a question of morality versus a question of reality? Well, let's think about it. So, no matter what is happening inside of a dictatorial style or monarchy style rule, what you will find is that everything can be justified via morality. It's never justified through the actions of individuals, but instead justified through morality. Now, in an elective system, at the core of it, no matter what else you look at, whether they're talking about it's about representation, blah, blah, if you look at the core of it, it's a question of morality. You start off with a very general piece of philosophy, which is morality subjective or objective? If you start with that, then you have to decide from one side or the other. If it's objective and it can be passed down through a king, then of course it makes sense that you have some kind of divine dictator who can pass the laws down to us and tell us exactly what the gods are saying. And so he can tell us exactly how to live our lives. But in a subjective world where there is no good or evil, but instead there are opinions coming from all angles, and that no one can represent God or any God more than any other human, then instead what we need is an elective system that represents every single person. And even if we get the answer wrong, because that's what some people don't get, it's not about getting the answer right. Even if we get the answer wrong, we can say we got the answer wrong. Not that one person oppressed us, not that one person got the answer wrong, not that one person represented us, but instead us as a group decided to get this wrong. Now, knowing this information, why did people in the Jollof states, why did the people in some Ethiopian states, and why did some other Africans choose elections, even if they were Islamic, meaning that they know an objective morality exists?
The political organization of the Wolof Empire can be compared to a confederacy. The Boba, or the king, the Boba, was elected by a college of electors, which, as the empire began to spread, also included the rulers of the component states. Although these rulers paid annual tribute to the Boba, that is the king of the Wolofs, they were virtually autonomous. This system of administration ensured that vassal states under the Wolof Kingdom could avoid electing a tyrant who would impose his will or on them or meddle with their internal affairs.
So, of course, in other parts of Islam, some of the leaders are thought not to be gods, but to be passing the judgment of God on earth. I mean, some of them claim to be direct descendants of Muhammad, and that's in Africa, by the way. I'm not even talking about faraway lands. Some people were saying that we are descendants of Muhammad, and therefore we have to inherit the power and the blah, 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 blah. And so they have the right to rule through the hereditary line. But in this kingdom, even though the majority of people were Islamic and some of them were not, it still was up to the people how they wanted to rule. Now, let's start with the fact that the Jollof or the Wolof, whatever you want to call them, they started off as hereditary. The first two kings are related, but then after that, they stopped being related. And this is not because the kingdom didn't have this in its initial DNA. It's always been this way in Senegal, as you see with people like the Wali or any other kingdom that arises, tends to have an underlying election version of their rulers. But if there is a true way to live and a non true way to live, so in other words, if there's good and then there's evil, why shouldn't someone who is in the position, a high position, tell people at the bottom how to live so that they can live a good life? Well, of course, what we see is that they don't concern themselves, the Wolof, they don't concern themselves with what the good life is necessarily. Now, there are books from Timbuktu and places like that where they were way more concerned with how to live rather than independence or living a good life from a personal point of view. Now, of course, there are some versions of elected systems that are more representative of the people than others. The one of the Jollof, for the most part, was trying to avoid wars and trying to keep the idea that an individual is an individual. But this did not stop them from trying to take each other over. In other words, sometimes, and you notice this also in the kingdoms or the republic in the Americas, sometimes people would want the territory of a neighbor. In an elective system, the problem is majority rules. And so when majority rules, what happens? If I want to take your territory and five other people agree with me and you're the only one who disagrees, your territory is mine. And this was one of the things that they did. One of the ways to avoid that is that you say every single person has to agree on the decision. The problem with that is because your kingdom becomes stale because how can you get everyone to agree? At that point, bribery and corruption will become the order of the day. So, last time I read Jean, a Frenchman who came with the mindset of democracy and all of that. This is from the 1600s. The person writing this, Alfred Dapper, he did not live under democracy. He did not even care about democracy as more moral or less moral than any other system. But on speaking on the exact same kingdom as the later Frenchman, this is what he said. The government is not hereditary from father to son, but three or four of grandees elect a king, amongst them of the noblest stock. Unlike the Gurgram of the Bornu Empire or many other empires, you can see in this one, by names alone, that not everybody is related. This means that some people were simply chosen for their skill. Now, of course, one of the things that's going to happen is that people who happen to be in the elites are more likely to become the king. Also, of course, like I mentioned, there's no short terms. So it's until you die when you lose your power. And of course, there is sabotage. There are people who will come after you if you are too much of a tyrant. But something that you will notice is that some of these people are related. For example, you can see there the last king on the list, Mbamburi Nyabu and Bakatam Buri Nyabu. Those two are definitely related. And so is the one in the middle. Well, this brings me to the advantage of the hereditary system. See, the thing about the hereditary system, the advantage that it has is that the people who live in a hereditary lifestyle inherit the morality of their father, first and foremost, meaning that the culture does not dot around based on the will of the elected person. And so, whatever belief continues to permeate throughout the kingdom for a very long time. And so, even in elective worlds, people tend to want to elect people who know each other or at least are related. And this did happen, as you can see here. He continues to say, currently or presently, after the election, they drive out of the country again upon the least distaste. When the king dies, his eldest brother takes upon him the dominion, and after he's deceased, all his other brothers successively, and when they are all dead, at last the children, according to their degree of age, or for want of children, the eldest son of his brother. But the advantages don't stop there. One of the things is that a lot of people who live in poverty or live in a lower status than that of the kings and the nobles want to live the life of the nobles. And so they want them to create life like their own. This is an advantage because they're very familiar with how they live. And so they elect these people to try and emulate those systems. A second, and this is probably the most important, is that the people who are elite tend to be more educated than people who are not. More educated on the realities of the kingdom, more educated in general, and have better access to information than most people. This puts them in a position where people will trust them because, of course, why would you trust the ignorant over the wise? But again, this does not mean that this system does not have any pushbacks or does not have any flaws. Because, of course, the biggest flaw is that they cannot relate to the people at the bottom. And anything they do, they're doing it from observation, not real life. And also, they might have no concern for uplifting people who live in those positions who want to be in their positions, but instead be concerned on how to maintain the kingdom as it is, even if the people at the bottom do not agree with how it is. So, this is where we get this concept of the cultural versus the new. See, the hereditary system by design is cultural, meaning it's to maintain things that are old. But the elective system is about keeping things fresh. And that is why places like the Wolof and other kingdoms remained completely up to date with the rest of the world, because whenever they needed to pivot, whenever they needed to change allies, whenever they needed to do anything, whenever they needed to take up arms or learn some new skill or borrow from their neighbors, they just did it. They did not care about maintaining the traditions for a very long time. And that did happen. They lost a lot of their traditions. I'll give you a good example. Remember, there was a part where Jean talked about how even though iron smelting existed there, they relied on European iron for trade, a lot of it. But why? Well, it's because they don't care about the traditional version of it. What they care about mostly is the fact that it's useful in their kingdom. You will also notice that elective states seem to be very open to the idea of multicultural states. So, in other words, they don't care if you're from a different race or whatever, as long as you can benefit the individuals within and you come up with good ideas. In a hereditary state, again, it's almost like pushing away. You cannot start introducing new people. I mean, look at the state of these hereditary kingdoms. One of the worst things they did was marry their own relatives. And this form of disgusting tradition continued and was almost inherent. And I'll tell you why. The Ptolemies did it. Some Native American groups did it. Some people in Japan did it. The pharaohs did it. It's something that is inside of this type of method, and it's not good to keep the bloodline pure, so to speak, by doing such an unnatural act, at least not for most people. Now think about the other one. So think about this one. When you concern yourself too much on who are the people who are ruling more than you care about what they're actually saying and what they're doing, you end up with a system which might work. I mean, ancient Egypt worked for a pretty long time, but you end up with a system that in itself is inherently immoral if you believe in objective morality.